Are about to spend the next 18 months in Sri Lanka on their own Mission Impossible.
It's just a huge element of luck to this.
Together, they challenge poachers, beasts, and the dark.
Gordon, we have sight of the leopard.
To find the leopards of Yala.
Sunday night at 7 Central Time on any TV.
Reading Rainbow Young Writers and Illustrators Contest Celebration. Join the fun on Saturday, May 24th in Lincoln's Haymarket during Farmers Market from 9 to noon. We'll be in the Ridenour Room, 809 P Street. Enjoy storytellers and activities for the whole family, and the Reading Rainbow Contest winners will be recognized at 10:30. Be more fun, May 24th at Lincoln's Farmers Market with NETV.
The Nebraska legislature is back in session, and you can see live coverage on NETV2. From gavel to gavel, follow all the events as they happen from the floor of the unicameral. Plus, watch statewide each week for more in-depth reporting on Nebraska's lawmakers. Watch and be more informed.
It's not.
It is so.
It is not.
It's so. It is so.
Ancient tribal artifact or just a rock? Better call the History Detectives, starting July 14th, only on PBS.
From the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is NETV.
Welcome to the future. PBS Digital.
It only took one day to change America forever.
Terrorism is something that will be with us for generations.
We now have to look closely at every plane, every port.
We're in a world that does not track international shipping.
You can have anywhere from 4 to 15 or 20 separate threats each day.
These are scenarios that experts consider in the hopes that you will never have to.
Our challenge is to get it right every day. All the bad guy has to do is get it right once.
But there also are steps we can take over generations, because it might take a lifetime of effort to stop an instant of horror.
Failed states matter because they just don't fail and sit there. Failed states are breeding grounds for terrorist organizations who can go in there and operate without fear. They're operating with impunity.
You have a potential army of recruits on the streets of those countries.
We will travel to a country at the crossroads, deciding whether to retreat inward or reach forward.
Iranians are enormously frustrated because they can taste freedom, and there is now a new generation willing to go to greater lengths to get it.
But one of the greatest threats to our security is not a culture, an ideology, or a weapon. It is a disease.
25 million people have died. There'll be 100 million people in 8 years. If you get up to 100 million people, you're going to have some failed states.
It's becoming increasingly clear that global health itself is a very critical security and stability issue.
The world is a smaller place. Local conflicts are more global. Weapons are more lethal, and violence is more random. Tonight, the new reality of confronting terrorism, turning the tide.
Good evening, I'm Walter Cronkite. Over the past 3 evenings, we've examined many challenges that, left unchecked, threaten to lead us ever closer to Armageddon. And one theme which runs throughout this series is the mandate to take hold of our own collective destiny. Tonight, we have a number of stories for you to consider. The first is set here at home, the others far from our shores. But they are all connected, differing fronts in our struggle against terror. Unlike previous times when we might have believed that what happened far away didn't affect us, now it does. If we had to choose one word or phrase that best sums up all of our efforts to stem the threats of nuclear weapons, of chemical and biological agents, of all forms of terrorism, it would probably be Homeland Security. It's a term most of us had never heard or considered before the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001. Now it is a part of our everyday vocabulary. But what does it mean? Is it a return to the fallout shelter mentality of the 1950s and 60s? Or is it a measured response to a new set of facts? What can we expect of those charged with protecting us? And what must we expect of ourselves? We begin in San Francisco.
All right. Okay, our tail's clear of the hills. If you want to bring it down at bridge level for me, that'd be great. All right.
The Golden Gate Bridge is generally recognized as the king of the bridges, or the queen of the bridges, as it were. And it is certainly a huge source of pride for the people, not only of San Francisco, but California. It's an international icon. It's in the same category as the Statue of Liberty and other icons.
And an increasingly daunting responsibility. More than 115,000 vehicles cross the bridge each day, more than 40 million each year. As part of U.S. Highway 101, it's a vital transportation link between Marin County and the city of San Francisco.
The state of California has provided security forces with the National Guard and the California Highway Patrol, which has been invaluable. And we're very grateful to them for that, because just having body security people costs lots of money.
A dozen local, state, and federal agencies, hundreds of people, are now involved in the daily security of the bridge. National Guard, Park Police, Coast Guard. Measures range from bicycle patrols to a sophisticated command center, to 2 helicopters in the air around the clock.
We check all what the national security is deemed a sensitive area.
We have people literally on top, over, under the bridge, ensuring that it is as safe as it can be. I use this bridge on a regular basis, my family does, and I feel pretty safe about it.
In the year after September 11th, 2001, there were more than half a dozen reported threats on the bridge. In July of 2002, Spanish authorities recovered videotapes of various American landmarks, including the Golden Gate Bridge, believed to have been taken by Al-Qaeda operatives. But San Francisco authorities have a good deal more to worry about than just the bridge.
Obviously, this is one of the world's major seaports, and so there's a tremendous amount of shipping traffic that goes in and out of the Golden Gate Bridge, and every one of those ships passes underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, and there's oil tankers, and there's freighters, and there's any number of smaller ships in and out of here every day.
Although we spent a lot of money in airports, we've spent not nearly enough money on port security, which is one of the real problems, with 50 or 1,000 or so containers entering the country every day, with a very small percentage of them being checked.
And so what you have is potentially very ripe targets, as essentially ports become the on-ramp and off-ramp of our global economy, concentrated as they are in just a few places. That if you disrupt that port, you basically have a huge impact on the U.S.'s trade, and also on things like energy supplies.
On an average day, thousands of containers go under the Golden Gate. 1,500 for the port of Oakland, the 4th busiest container port in the country. From there, they are hauled by trains and trucks across the United States.
We have to realize we have a system that moves the bulk of the world's trade around that has no security. Anybody with $2,500 in Asia can get a 40-foot by 8-foot box dropped off into their lot, and they can load it with 30 tons of material. There are no requirements that that loading be inspected.
I mean, how do you know if somebody has got a small nuclear device they perfected in some Middle Eastern country and put on a freighter, which is going to dock in Portland, Maine, get unloaded onto a pickup truck and driven to New York? I mean, those are hard things to deal with. That is my concern, a weapon of mass destruction.
And we have cases of where we get hard intelligence that a ship is loaded with illicit drugs, and we can't find the damn ship. That's a pretty horrific set of circumstances to be in. But we're in a world that does not track international shipping.
More than 14 million containers move through United States ports each year. With limited time and resources, customs agents can screen only about 2% of them.
Negative, Captain, negative. I want you to alter your course to port and come to the pilot boat.
The Port of Oakland has a pilot program to try to meet the problem. Sea marshals board every ship before it enters San Francisco Bay. 12 miles outside the Golden Gate, marshals inspect a vessel arriving from Shanghai.
Sea Marshal Port Security boarding. And so what I'll need is passports and licenses of your crew, and then also an assistant to go around with my team to do a sweep through the vessel.
If the marshals discover anything suspicious, those containers will be fully inspected at port. Part of the solution to our security problem lies in technology. The examination of closed containers is just one of the challenges being addressed at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories outside of San Francisco.
Well, today only a small fraction of the cargo containers are actually opened. And what we'd like to do is come up with technologies that can look at the cargo container from the outside without having to open them and see if there's anything hazardous within the container. And in this case, we're measuring those with a gamma ray detector, and the operator then at the port can distinguish between chemicals that are explosives and chemicals that are chemical weapons.
Driving along, we're taking an X-ray image of the contents of the container, and through the image we can decide whether or not there are items that are out of the ordinary or abnormal or inconsistent with what's supposed to be there, and if it is, the items are then removed and inspected by hand. The top priority for U.S. Customs is an anti-terrorist role. We look for nuclear weapons, anything that can be used to assemble a weapon of mass destruction, a dirty bomb, a nuclear threat. In addition, we look for narcotics, weapons, anything that's pretty much a threat to the United States and its borders.
One bridge, one port. Compound this across the nation, and we begin to sense the challenge we face. September 11th changed our perspective, our thinking, our national psyche. It made us feel vulnerable in ways we never had before.
The whole notion of, for 200 years, our country had this great ocean on the left side and this great ocean on the right side, and we were isolated from so much of the world's negativism, whether it was World War II or whether it was World War I or whether it was whatever it was. Even as late as the Desert Storm experience, it was over there. This was now a new front, and the new front is our own homeland.
3,000 Americans were killed. The devastation for their families. I'm a New Yorker. It was personal. One of my best friends was on the airliner that hit the Pentagon. I lost friends from high school. For us, the fact that we couldn't stop this attack, notwithstanding the thousands of lives we believe we've saved for many years against terrorist acts, is not only a point of reflection, it's a point of action for us.
If there's a terrorist attack, much of the federal government's response will be coordinated from here, an emergency command center buried 2,000 feet into Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado.
Take the proper steps to activate the MWOMs for a test.
Teams specializing in nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons stand by, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. Since October of 2002, the Northern Command has been directing the military's response.
We focus on this all day, every day.
Air Force General Ralph Eberhart is the military officer in charge of domestic security. His team tries to anticipate and strategize every potential scenario.
And we do this as an interagency organization. Although this is a military command working for the Secretary of Defense, we have representatives from many other government agencies, and we're about to have an exercise where we'll have upward to 40 different government agencies represented, because this cooperation is very, very important. One of our commanders likes to say, at the scene of an incident, you don't want to be exchanging business cards. You want to already know each other.
As FBI Director Robert Mueller puts it,
The work that we're doing now with the CIA, with the NSA, with DIA in terms of exchanging information far surpasses what was allowable prior to September 11th. The Patriot Act and other court rulings have enabled us to change the way we do business and to exchange information in ways that we were precluded from doing before September 11th.
Air Force Lieutenant Colonel William Glover.
And what this is a direct feed that we're receiving from FAA that gives us all the aircraft that are talking to FAA or about to have filed a flight plan to talk with FAA. For example, if you look right now down here in the bottom, you'll see that there are over 5,000 aircraft currently airborne that are under FAA control. This particular aircraft that I've identified here is an American Airlines Flight 34. He's at 37,000 feet, flying 470 knots an hour. He's going from Los Angeles to JFK. He's a Boeing 762, and he's due to land at 2058 Zulu.
Our challenge is to get it right every day, day after day, flight after flight, passenger after passenger. All the bad guy has to do is get it right once. We have to get it right every other time, including, hopefully, the once.
In Washington, D.C., the intelligence agencies make their own daily evaluations.
The CIA and the FBI put together a joint threat matrix every night, and that joint threat matrix is what we work off the following morning, and you can have anywhere from 4 to 15 or 20 separate threats, generally each day. They can be threats to embassies overseas, they can be threats to our troops in Afghanistan, or elsewhere. They can be threats to cities in the United States, and they cover the gamut.
With the sniper shootings in and around Washington, D.C. in October of 2002, we saw how one or two people with a single rifle and a handful of bullets could terrorize an entire region. Like crime, terrorism can be combated, but it is unlikely we can ever eliminate it completely.
We can be as good as we can be. We, the FBI, what we do for a living, but I'm going to tell you, the honest truth is we'll never be 100%. Terrorism is something that will be with us for generations. In its worst manifestations, the things we worry about the most are how terrorists will acquire chemical, biological, and nuclear capabilities. That's what I lose sleep about at night.
Our great concern is that a terrorist group will have access to a weapon of mass destruction, and if given access, I think there are very few people who believe that they would be constrained from using it.
The prospect of a chemical or biological attack is among the most terrifying scenarios imaginable, especially to the scientists and technicians working to lessen the threat.
Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory was founded during the Cold War. Its mission was and has always been national security. Weapons of mass destruction are things that I worry a lot about and that we have special expertise for here at the laboratory. I think an important thing to understand is we at this laboratory and our sister laboratories actually have been working on counterterrorism for over a decade.
Livermore's Atmospheric Release Advisory Center, or NARAC, is a national support and resource center for dealing with chemical, biological, and radiological emergencies. Here, programs are being developed to predict the impact and spread of deadly biological agents, such as this simulation of an attack in Seattle. The greater Seattle area is home to almost 2 million people.
Our mission here is to provide, to do plume projections of any type of material that gets put in the atmosphere that moves with the atmosphere. Primarily, we're looking at chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological elements. What do you think about this? We calculate where this material will go downwind and what will be the effect on the people downwind. And that allows emergency responders, emergency managers to take emergency action and also to provide for, after the event, how many people were exposed, how bad really was it. What we see here is a continuation of this anthrax plume, and
the power of this is it allows us to project ahead what people are at risk and what people are not at risk. And that's absolutely crucial for an emergency responder to know where his hazards are and where he needs to take precautions and try and get the people out of harm's way.
When you think about risk, it's the trade-off between what's most likely and what's the consequence. And I think that's a difficult equation to understand, I think, completely right now. I think there are some things that are more likely, but there are other things that maybe are less likely, but the consequence is extremely high.
Smallpox is an example of that. Even if only 5 cases of smallpox occurred in this country, we would, in short order, shut down much of our transportation. I think we'd be talking about things like quarantines, which may not be necessary, but clearly would be considered, and we would see people in a mad panic state scrambling to go and try to find smallpox vaccine.
Dr. Michael Osterholm, an epidemiologist, is among the leading experts on chemical and biological hazards. In that nightmare world, there is probably no scenario with greater consequences than one involving smallpox. It scars its victims and attacks them with fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. Lesions develop in the nose and mouth. There's a 30% mortality rate in those not vaccinated.
We've estimated that at least 300 million people died from smallpox. That, to calibrate that a bit, the New York Times at one time said that there were 100 million who died during the 20th century, either directly or indirectly as a result of armed conflict. 3 times that number, at least, died from smallpox.
There is enough vaccine on hand to inoculate every American in an emergency, but there are potential side effects. According to Centers for Disease Control estimates, 1 person in 1,000 would require medical attention. 1 person in 1,000,000 could die during a mass vaccination.
The key to rapid detection and response to a biological terrorism event and controlling disease and limiting casualties is really engaging the public health and medical care community, because they're going to be the first responders.
The most effective strategy in the U.S. as we see it today would be, first of all, to isolate the patient, vaccinate those who've been in contact with him, and others who would be their household contacts of the contacts. And we would make vaccine then available to those who wished it, but we would not want to undertake a mass vaccination.
A lot of people were really overwhelmed by the challenge. Now we can no longer afford to just put it in the too hard box or deny that the threat is real. And now I think cities all over the nation and around the world are starting to think seriously about how would we respond to a threat and how can we better prepare.
Today, we have to understand that the civilians of this country are the army that the terrorists will attack, that they have weapons that we will never know exist until they actually are used, and that where they hit us could be at any time, any place in this country.
We need to translate our knowledge of our understanding of this enemy down to the lowest level of our government. That means the policeman or woman on the beat.
Yeah, can you stop at the scene to retrieve personal items?
We have to educate about what are you looking for? What kinds of tools do you have at your disposal to help us?
10-4.
We need to make security essentially an organic part of basically how we manage our lives. Just like we have made safety an organic part of so much of how our life works, in our cars and in our homes and in our workplace.
94 Control.
Stand by, you stand by.
Most of our major cities in this country are reasonably well rehearsed to deal with natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding, these kinds of issues. Most of the tools we need in place to deal with those threats will also help us deal with the catastrophic terrorist attack.
I believe that all of the training that we have gone through and the experiences we've had with earthquakes, in earthquake preparedness, and in all of the things that we've done have frankly given us the edge in preparation for any unforeseen eventuality, including terrorism.
Hello? Hello? We're with the NERT. We're here to help you. Let me check the lights.
Robert and James Wong are participating in an earthquake rescue drill.
What got us started was, we wanted to be more self-sufficient in case of an earthquake or whatever, even a terrorist attack. We want to make sure that we're stable enough that we don't need the help.
This realistic training is part of a program known as NERT, for Neighborhood Emergency Response Teams. It grew out of the Bay Area's experience with quakes like Loma Prieta in 1989. NERT membership spiked after 9/11.
These are what we call go bags, which have equipment that I can just grab and go out on the scene.
You also should have some kind of tarp to put on the ground because of the wetness.
I carry various things, like I keep tons of garbage bags. You can also use it for poncho, a raincoat.
These type of military type of sleeping bags.
The Wongs, like the NERT program itself, have expanded their readiness for different types of disasters.
These will fit over any 5-gallon bucket. What you have to do is double insulate it with 2 trash bags, and then put a little kitty litter on the bottom.
Can you hear me? Say anything?
Hey, how's it going?
NERT's motto is, don't be a victim and do the most good for the most people. Concentrate on your family first, and then from there, go out.
The Wongs may have taken readiness farther than most of us can.
Cell phones do not work when there's a big disaster. They will be overloaded, and the only thing that will work is ham radios.
We've all gotten ham radio licenses, and that's one way of keeping us in communication with each other.
You can get up on the chair?
But in uncertain times, they'd be the best of neighbors.
Civilians cannot expect the government to do everything. You have to take it upon themselves to be aware of the situation, their surroundings. They know what is going around them. You're familiar with your own personal surroundings. The government is not.
First and foremost, I think America has to be aware that there is no way to guarantee the safety of every American from every possible threat. That is just an impossibility, and it should never be out there. We obviously shouldn't conduct ourselves foolishly where we increase the risk. We should not try to build a wall around America in any fashion. We shouldn't try to build a wall around any city.
Are we safer than we were on 9/11? Yes, we are safer than we were on 9/11 for a variety of reasons. But even though the American public is safer, even though we are moving heaven and earth to do the best job possible to protect the American public, we are still vulnerable.
We had a great run where essentially we lived in this splendid land with virtually nobody coming here to mess with us. That run is over. But there's a lot that we can do to manage this threat in constructive ways. Basically go to the American people and treat them like adults and say, these are vulnerabilities, these are issues, we can help in some areas, we can in others. We need to roll up our sleeves as a society and get to work in managing these problems.
We're in this for the long run. This is a global war on terrorism, and this is not a war of, in my view, days or weeks or months or maybe even single-digit years. This will be more like the Cold War than any war that we've experienced over the last decade or so. And we as Americans must commit ourselves to winning that war. We cannot afford to lose it.
Homeland security is, as the term suggests, a response here on the home front. But its real test may come half a world away in remote places where terrorists build their deadly networks. It drives home a point. We are connected to the rest of the world, whether we like it or not. And in this context, it may be the weakest countries that pose the greatest threat of all. It used to be that when a state failed, for whatever reason, it often did so in isolation. The age of technology and global communications has changed all that.
Fail states matter because they just don't fail and sit there. failed states are breeding grounds for terrorist organizations who can go in there and operate without fear. They're operating with impunity. So you just can't have failed states, because if there's a failed state, there are failing people in that failed state.
If you had asked a year or two ago, where's the place in the world least likely to affect the United States, you probably would have looked over the map and picked some absolutely remote place in the middle of nowhere, up in some mountains, landlocked, far from anything. You'd pick Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, at war with the Soviet Union in the 80s.
After that war, as the government of the United States has now publicly said, the United States and the rest of the world just walked away from Afghanistan, left the country in ruins, and ruined it even more.
Afghanistan, at war with itself in the 90s. 1 million people dead, millions more forced to leave. A ruined country that came under the rule of the Taliban. Like all women under Taliban rule, Karima Selak, a wife and mother of 2, became a virtual prisoner in her home, forbidden to work or have a life of her own.
Women have always had their place. Islam has never prohibited this. The dictatorial regime that came to power in the name of Islam were not Muslims themselves. They debased Islam throughout the world.
Life was extremely difficult. Women were despairing, and the fact that they were kept from going to school, and the fact that they were kept imprisoned in their own homes, that women felt that they were being, their rights were taken away from them. They were being rendered as non-persons.
The first victims of any kind of radicalism, extremism, whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim, I think the first target is women. They wanted to recreate a new kind of state with a new kind of population, which would be totally subservient to their control. As a result, they felt that, in order to do this, they had to subdue women, because women were the keepers of tradition. They are, nurturers of home and hearth, and of the family and of social structures, and this is precisely what the Taliban were adamant on destroying.
Any nation that refuses to use 50% of its talent is bound to lose out. An eagle cannot fly on one wing and soar. Why would they expect the nation to be able to do that? A better educated woman means a better educated family. A better educated girl means a healthy worker in the economy.
Girls could only be educated in secret at tremendous risk. For 6 years, Mrs. Selak ran an underground school for girls in her own home, fearing for her life if she were ever discovered.
The advantage to not having schools and having them inside private houses was that the girls could come in with their burqas and, if questioned, say they were visiting relatives because it wasn't a formal school.
Now Karima Selak is senior minister at the new Women's Affairs Ministry, in charge of social welfare and vocational training. Today, women have a voice in the running of Afghanistan.
The difference between then and now is day and night. No part of society, according to Islam, has been banned to women. Now, thank God, we have our freedom.
Almost every day, women come to Mrs. Selak's office seeking work. She sees work and education as the means to improving the lot of women, therefore, the lot of the country in general.
In situations where the women's rights are ignored, where their rights are trampled upon, where they are denied access to education, where they are not allowed to vote, you see that the society is often not only not as free, but not as prosperous.
With few resources, Mrs. Selleck is striving to break the cycle of poverty and illiteracy. The Women's Home Ministry has set up training programs like this one that teaches women to sew.
Of course, if you're taking care of the women, especially when women are the majority, you in that society are giving the hope that this is a true democracy, justice to the majority who has been marginalized for so long really gives a very positive picture that the government is working for justice for all.
Among the programs Mrs. Selleck has established is one that provides training and modest financial assistance for women to set up beauty parlors. Under the Taliban, beauty parlors were banned. Now they are a public symbol of the rights and dignity of women. But Mrs. Selleck's work cannot succeed without a secure environment.
If you don't have security in the country, you cannot do anything. It's not possible to bring development. It's not possible to bring peace. It's not possible to educate the people.
However, security remains tenuous, despite a United Nations peacekeeping force 4,300 strong that provides security for Kabul and the surrounding area. And roughly 10,000 U.S. troops are operating in Afghanistan.
I think the main security threat, in my view, is that if the generosity of the international community fails to keep pace with what has been accomplished militarily, there is a danger of a gap that could be induced that would cause the people of Afghanistan not only to lose hope, but to lose patience. It might make them vulnerable to other entities that did not see a democratic process and a democratically elected government is in the best interest of Afghanistan.
2 government ministers have been killed, dozens of bombs have been set off, and there have been numerous assassination attempts against interim President Hamid Karzai. Away from Kabul, well-armed regional warlords and their private armies threaten the power, stability, and authority of the central government. The greatest hope for long-term peace and not leaving Afghanistan vulnerable again rests with a new national army and security established from within.
Simply by helping the nation of Afghanistan provide for its own security, the chances of us having to come back and fight al-Qaeda or another organization on Afghan soil again are greatly lessened.
U.S. and French officers are training the first recruits, taken from many tribes who, not too long ago, were fighting each other. It will be years before the Afghan National Army is strong enough to go it alone.
They're used to loyalty to a particular tribe or to a particular warlord. And now we're asking them to all work together. Hazara, Uzbek, Tajik, Nuristani, Waziristani, Pashtun. And what amazes them is that they're all standing in the same uniform, standing in the same formation, fighting on the same side for a change. It's the challenge getting them to do that. We build teams out of what used to be enemies. And that's the whole point of why we're here and why we're doing this.
Building a nation takes time, especially a nation which has been in the war for the last 24 years, fighting against communism, fighting against terrorism, fighting against poverty, fighting against neighbors who were interfering in Afghanistan.
While Afghan troops are being trained, an increasing number of American civil affairs units try to keep the peace. They operate in areas not yet safe enough for civilian relief workers and non-governmental organizations, NGOs.
That's the leader. We're surrounded by landmines, snipers, so the NGOs won't even come here. But since they can't come here, we're going to step up to the plate. We're going to take care of these people. We don't want them to suffer just because the NGOs can't get into their area. Also let them know we have a female doctor.
Okay, let me just, okay, relax. Tell them to rest. I got some cream in there.
Here, look up to the sky. Okay, close. Good. All right. Just like that. She can open. There you go.
Ali Shah Khan, his wife and 2 children have returned to Afghanistan, joining one of the largest refugee migrations in history. A rickshaw driver in Pakistan, he wants to farm in his homeland.
We spent 12 years in Pakistan. Now that there is peace and stability in Afghanistan, we have come back.
During the 2 decades of warfare, about a quarter of the Afghan population, almost 7 million people, left their home. The majority, desperate and poor, fled to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. More than 2 million people have returned to Afghanistan since the fall of the Taliban. With millions more still abroad, the numbers continue to grow, further straining resources. At the Pulat-Sharki Refugee Center in Kabul, Ali Shah and his family receive a lecture on landmines. Afghanistan is one of the most heavily mined countries in the world. About 10 Afghans are killed or wounded by mines each day, many of them children.
Okay.
Ali Shah and his family are given a large sack of wheat and a tent as a temporary shelter. Now they are on their own.
God willing, war is finished. I hope that God helps us and we can take part in reconstruction.
We are concerned that we may have well over a million plus Afghans who will need help. So the humanitarian assistance is urgent. It is not a luxury. And they need resources for both, for the humanitarian and the reconstruction.
With all of their belongings piled into a rented truck, Ali Shah and his family set off to find his childhood home. Leaving the refugee camp in Kabul, the capital city is barely recognizable to him.
I am surprised to see so many people. I have come back after many years of war, and there are still such crowds of people here.
Ali Shah travels north toward the Shamali Plain. The land he remembers as a child was lush and fertile. Now it is brown and barren. The end result of 2 decades of war and 4 years of drought. The trip is a dangerous one. Armed checkpoints offer little protection from bandits. Roads are littered with destroyed tanks. The once fertile fields now sown with landmines.
It is a country that is really in crisis since the early 70s. So there is physical devastation. There is exhaustion of the people. They have no more resources, they have no more houses, they have no more infrastructure.
There is virtually no functioning telephone system anywhere in the country. There is no supply of electricity in most of the country. Most people don't have safe drinking water. About 1/5 to 1/4 of all children die before the age of 5. It has the highest rate of women dying in childbirth of any country in the world.
Eventually, Ali Shah arrives at his village.
Everyone likes their homeland, and now I have a chance to come back to mine.
Many refugees return to find no trace of the life they left behind. Ali Shah is more fortunate than most. His house was not totally destroyed. Still, he is too proud to let anyone inside to see the ruins of his old home. It is a race against time to rebuild before the harsh winter sets in. If he does not complete the repairs in time, his family will be forced to move back to a refugee camp. Just as Ali Shah struggles to rebuild his home, every aspect of Afghan life must be reconstructed. But the need is so great, Almost 2/3 of the funds donated by the international community are directed toward the most basic needs of survival.
We have not really seen even the beginning yet of infrastructure building, the recreation of an educational system, a health system, etc. All these things that Afghans need to rechannel their energies away from the past. We just haven't seen this kind of reconstruction effort.
The World Bank estimates the cost to reconstruct Afghanistan at $10 billion. Donor nations have pledged about half that amount.
There is a very strong argument for the reconstruction of Afghanistan, so it never falls back into the situation it was before, where it attracted people from around the world to go and train there. That makes a lot of sense. And so failed nation states will incubate terrorism.
If you think about what you could have done with $10 billion in Afghanistan over the past 20 years, it would be a completely different country, and you would never have had to expend those $10 billion that I think the U.S. by itself spent over the past year.
Ali Shah wins his race against winter, rebuilding his home into an adequate shelter. He and his family show what individuals can do to affect their own lives and society. But it is the children who pose the greatest challenge. Almost half the Afghan population is under 18. Most are illiterate. Many suffer from disease. More than 1 million children have been orphaned or abandoned.
In any society which is struck by a huge catastrophe, such as Afghanistan, that is 23 years of war, 1.5 million dead, the first impact is felt on the family. There is always a breakdown of family life, of normal existence. Just the very nature of the war produced tens of thousands of orphans. And these orphans became the foot soldiers of the Taliban. Some of them became the foot soldiers of Al-Qaeda.
These kids extract the maximum benefit from minimum possibilities. God willing, they will rebuild the country.
Omid is 12 years old, one of 5 children, and the oldest son. He and his family have just returned from 6 years in a refugee camp in Pakistan. Now they live amidst the rubble and ruin of the area of Kabul hit hardest by war. Omid's father has a street stall where he sells batteries and whatever else he can acquire, but customers are few and profits are slim. Omid has become the principal breadwinner. Like thousands of other Kabul children, he must work or beg in the streets to keep his family going.
The Afghan economy is at zero right now. We hear a lot about reconstruction aid, but we have not seen anything. Our neighborhood has not seen any help. Homes have not been rebuilt. People are still living in mosques. We don't have a minute's rest. Our women and even our children must go out and earn a living.
Omid sells newspapers on the street 8 to 10 hours a day. A full day's work will earn him the equivalent of about $1 US. With that, he can buy the minimal basics for his family, mostly bread and sugar. Rice is a rare treat.
I sell between 10 and 15 newspapers a day. I use my smarts and I push it on people.
Omid desperately wants an education. His goals are touchingly basic. One of them is to be able to read the newspapers he sells. Taking a break from work, he sets off for school. He hasn't been to class in more than a month. Omid is in the 2nd grade. He should be in the 6th grade, but couldn't attend school while he was a refugee in Pakistan.
Where have you been? What have you been doing?
I had to work.
What kind of work were you doing?
We did not have food at my home, so I had to work.
You could have come here in the morning and then worked. You could come and learn something. Do you understand, son? Don't do this again. You've been absent for almost 40 days. Sit down. He is small and young, and he should come here and learn something to secure his own future, to support himself, his family, and his country.
No matter his inspiring determination, his energy, his desire, it's difficult to conceive of Omid achieving his goal of literacy and education with less than 1 day a month in school.
Afghanistan always had a very low literacy level and few trained professionals. But for the past 20 to 25 years, different factions among the educated groups have been killing each other and arresting each other, and most of the educated and trained people fled the country. And that's part of the reason that a half-educated group like the Taliban was able to take over. You might say, in the land of the illiterate, the half-literate are kings.
This was a country whose previous leaders considered an educated population an enemy.
Taliban policy of imposing illiteracy upon the people of Afghanistan was to just create a nation which is destitute, so they would be able to implement their plans.
The people everywhere are demanding schools for both boys and girls. And it's the government that really cannot keep up with the demand. The government reopened all the schools this year for both boys and girls and expected, I believe, about 1.5 million pupils. And they've got 3 million pupils. And they would be a lot more if there were more facilities. Because people are quite aware of what they've lost and how far behind they were.
The kind of huge mass enthusiasm to go back to school, to learn something, I think is a reflection of how much the Afghan population, and children in particular, hope from the future.
I see the violence less in an educated society than uneducated society. I see the economical improvement in the country according to the literacy rate. For me, education is the basic tool to change the society.
As darkness falls, Omid is back on the streets, working late to make up for the time he spent at school. Omid's name means hope. What he wants most is the hope of a future.
There is freedom in Afghanistan. We are grateful there is no war and you can walk around freely. But we need peace and security. We should not go back to the past.
While we pursue these military and intelligence and law enforcement objectives on the ground every day, we have to give this government the wherewithal to raise the lot of life of their people. That would be the most powerful thing we can do to ensure that the Taliban never emerges again.
If we can create an environment where the average Afghan can go about his or her business in peace, where children can go to school, where women can choose either to put on the veil or not. If we have an Afghanistan that has an established government, which has authority over its territory, an Afghanistan that has managed to tame the regional warlords, then we can say we have a chance.
The future of Afghanistan is uncertain. In fact, out of all we have witnessed in this strife-torn land, only one thing is certain, and this is that, one way or another, Omid, all the Omids, are the future of Afghanistan. The opportunity is there to help to find that future, which inevitably, as we have seen, will intersect with our own.
We have made a partnership. We have become partners based on common interest. That partnership will continue, I'm sure. That partnership between Afghanistan and the United States.
We have come some degrees and some miles which have been very promising, and still it's promising And instead, it is a source of hope and optimism. But doesn't mean that we should forget the problems ahead. And these problems will stay for some time.
Our attention span is sometimes limited. We deal with a crisis, we focus on it, but then something else happens and we are gone. And I think we need to make every effort to sustain our interest in Afghanistan and help them get it right this time.
Also in that region lies the home of the first Islamic revolution in modern times. Iran is not a failed nation, but it is in conflict with the United States. President Bush has dubbed it part of the axis of evil because of its quest for weapons of mass destruction and support of terrorism. But a quarter century after the Ayatollah Khomeini's return, Iran is also in conflict with itself. There is a cultural and spiritual divide over the country's future. If the reformers prevail, Iran could become a powerful moderating force in the Islamic world. Yet world leaders, outsiders, cannot make reform happen. Change is in the hands of the generation born since the revolution of 1979. We begin with a young dentist in Tehran.
If you ask the young people about their frustrations, they would mainly answer you that they are not free.
Like many Iranians, 25-year-old Adib leads a double life.
I'm a dentist, my drummer is a doctor, he's a GP, our guitarist and the bassist, both of them are engineers.
If he could, Adib would be a full-time musician. Adib plays heavy metal music that is banned by the government censors. Given the restrictions on music, it's impossible to make a living as a professional musician. So 3 or 4 days a week, he can be found in his dental clinic, treating Tehran's elite. Adib must get permission from the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance to release his songs commercially. That's unlikely.
I'm a very angry person. I'm a kind of very angry person that is living in a place that he doesn't want to live.
Inside the first country to be ruled after an Islamic revolution, Muslims are intensely debating the idea of a new order in their regime, a new balance between mosque and state.
It is whether you can combine sort of salvation and liberty, whether there can be a system where you do not have to sacrifice your liberty in order to be religious, and you do not have to sacrifice your religious values in order to exercise your freedoms.
This is really the crux of the debate in Iran today. How strong should this religious side of government be? And the majority of Iranians, in voting in 4 elections since 1997, and in taking to the streets over the past 4 years, are saying we want a system of government that is predominantly secular. Islam may play a role, but it should be as the kind of guidance of society, not as the dictator or ultimate power in society.
Iran is actually trying to produce the whole process internally. There is no importing of democracy from the West. Democracy is being stumbled upon and gradually developed as an unintended consequence of resolving power struggles when there's no other way of doing so.
Iran's revolution down the road is likely to be seen by history as the turning point in the Islamic Reformation. And that's why it's one of the 3 great revolutions of modern times.
The struggle to find a balance between democracy and religion has been going on since Iran became the first modern Islamic state a quarter century ago. The outcome is likely to impact the future of Islamic movements throughout the world. In 1979, 2,500 years of monarchy rule ended in Iran when the Shah was driven into exile. Millions of Iranians from all walks of life were united in their desire to end the tyranny. The Shah had been supported by the United States and kept in power by a notorious secret police. Within days of the Shah's flight from Iran, Islamic fundamentalist leader Ayatollah Khomeini, exiled in France, returned triumphantly to Tehran.
We were coming back to the country with the leader of the revolution.
Nushabi Amiri was on the plane that brought Khomeini back to Iran.
I was dreaming of having an independent and free country. I was dreaming of an Iranian democracy.
The passion and fervor of militant Islam had a heroic appeal, especially to the younger generation.
They shouted for Khomeini. Everybody wanted to see Khomeini. He was a sort of symbol of all the wishes of a nation. He was symbol of all the wishes and of all the angers of a nation.
Ayatollah Khomeini called for an Iranian constitution. It would establish a new nation, ruled not by democratically elected politicians and an independent judiciary, but by a council of religious leaders enforcing strict Islamic law. The people voted overwhelmingly to create the Islamic Republic of Iran.
I was sure that we were going to become a very rich country, and people would, I thought people would be happy.
When the United States admitted the exiled Shah for medical treatment, angry Iranian university students seized the United States Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans hostage. What began as a small student-run protest was supported by the revolutionary government. It lasted 444 days and has scarred U.S.-Iranian relations ever since.
The biggest problem that I faced when I was president was the revolution in Iran and the capturing of our hostages and the keeping of them in captivity until the day I left the White House. And that's still a grievous memory for me.
There are two Irans. There's the Iran of the Supreme Leader and the IRGC, and people who support terrorism and people who support active programs of weapons of mass destruction that are acquiring chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons and advanced ballistic missile capability. Fact. There's another Iran, the 63% who were born after 1979, who've created a reform movement, an open press, elections, and a real yearning for a different system of government.
That first Iran began to sponsor terrorists in the Middle East in the early 80s.
Iran is involved not only with Hezbollah today, but also in supporting Islamic Jihad, which is where it is most controversial because Islamic Jihad has engaged in suicide bombings against Israeli targets. As long as Iran continues to support Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and Hamas, the United States government will continue to have Iran on its list of state sponsors of terrorism.
Iran's support of terrorism, together with its pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, led President Bush to equate it with Iraq and North Korea.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
The immediate reaction of the Iranian government and the Iranian people was outrage and shock. There was no reason whatsoever that the U.S. could lump Iran together with Iraq and North Korea.
The Iranian people have to make a choice. Do they want to be part of this 21st century world and stop aiding and abetting terrorism? Do they want to trade with the rest of the world? They want a better life for their people? Or they want to support terrorist activity and they want to develop weapons of mass destruction? which will buy them nothing except an added level of poverty for spending their money in this way. And there's a debate going on within Iran between what some call moderates and religious extremists, and the Iranian people are participating in this debate. So we believe that it was important for us to show that Iran is conducting these kinds of things, support to terrorism and trying to pursue weapons of mass destruction.
Iran wants weapons of mass destruction in part because it was attacked with weapons of mass destruction. In Tehran on Martyrs' Day, crowds commemorate the dead from Iraq's invasion in 1980. During the 8 years of grinding warfare that followed, Iraq attacked Iran with chemical weapons.
When we were gassed and when chemical weapons were used massively against us, no other country came to our help. Some other countries, including the United States, helped Saddam, directly and indirectly. But we were naive, and we paid a heavy cost for that. Iran lost 50,000 people. We lost 50,000 people in that chemical weapons war.
Now, the Iranian government also is building a uranium enrichment facility, ostensibly for their domestic power industry, which could be a step toward nuclear weapons.
Iran has fundamental, legitimate defense needs. Iran is living in a very dangerous neighborhood. I think Iranians are justifiably asking this question. Where was the world community back in the mid-80s when Iraqis used chemical weapons? Where was it?
Others in the Iranian leadership say U.S. support of Israel creates a double standard in the Middle East.
Why is Israel free to produce weapons of mass destruction in the region? Not only atomic, but chemical and biological, and no other country is allowed to.
I think that the American people don't know what's happening to their tax money. A portion of that tax money is being sent to the Zionist regime in form of bullets, which end up in the hearts and heads of Palestinian children and Palestinian youth, women, and I don't think that that is what the American people intend.
The divisions between Iran and the United States remain broad and deep.
We have a very serious cultural, but more than that, a very serious security problem today. And that is the problem of a mutually reinforcing Islamophobia in the West and sort of what I call Westophobia in the Islamic world. This provides a very fertile ground for extremists in the Islamic societies to be able to recruit.
Inside Iran now, reformists led by elected President Khatami are pushing for a more open and free society. In 1999, 20 years after the revolution, Iran held municipal elections.
Now, these are not perfect elections. Not everybody can run. But once the slate of candidates were chosen, then the vote was open, and nobody could rig it or nobody could dominate it. The unintended consequence of this is that the population has been going through an actual process of democratic practices, if you would want to call it. It's learning. Iranians now have the greatest deal of experience other than the Turks with actually elections. They vote in elections. Election results cannot be forecast. They don't get these 99.9% victory rates that Arab presidents get.
Almost 200,000 mayors and town council members were elected to public office. Under Iran's constitution, elected office holders are ruled by unelected religious leaders. The ultimate power remains with a religious council comprised of hardline fundamentalists who are unwilling to relinquish control.
The clerics, because they have veto power over presidential actions and parliamentary legislation, still have power. But they also know that the kids on the street have the real power. And in many ways, they're very nervous They're looking over their shoulders all the time at what the students are doing. And that's why there are likely to be moments of confrontation and tension inside Iran as it moves inches ever so slowly toward reform.
So a generation later, students are marching again in the streets of Tehran. But this time they are demanding an end to the repression and injustices imposed by Islamic law.
The democracy we are after is a democracy that is compatible with our history, religion, and our society. I'm certain that in the near future, we will have a model of democracy unique to us that will not have many of the flaws of democracy in other parts of the world.
You can't always say that student demonstrations indicate a crisis, a country in crisis. The interesting point is that the student demonstrations occur, and it comes in the press, it comes in the news, it comes in the parliament. It's debated openly. Parliament members are talking about these issues, are defending the rights of the students.
The power struggle in Iran is a very complicated game. There is one play in front of the screen and another behind the screen. For example, I have been accused that I have insulted the president. But I know that the real accusation is that we have created a student movement that has been trying to challenge those who are limiting the freedoms of the people.
Many Iranians will not speak so openly. Those who do speak out against the mullahs can face serious consequences. These students are protesting a death sentence handed down against a university professor and veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, who said that Muslims should not follow religious leaders blindly.
Iranians are enormously frustrated because they can taste freedom. They went through a revolution. They know what they want in terms of empowerment. And there is now a new generation with even greater appetite, willing to go to greater lengths to get it.
The death sentence against the professor was eventually revoked, but he is still in jail. During the past few years, dozens of activists have been imprisoned as the tension between modernity and conservatism intensifies.
Today's young people don't remember the Shah, and they are the largest segment of society, and they want change. They know because of globalization and access to information through satellites, through the internet, what's happening in the rest of the world, and they want to be part of it.
Around 20-25% of the population are students, and I think maybe 90% of them would love a big change to occur.
Hengama Shahidi is one of Iran's most prominent journalists. She is confident that Islam and reform can coexist.
It is the correct path and a good idea. I hope we will move towards democracy in practical steps until the day it's fully implemented.
In Iran today, reform is at best still a work in progress. Nothing is certain. But reformists say their movement is the best, perhaps the only hope of an alternative to the power and mass appeal of Islamic extremists. Reform, they say, must come from within the Muslim world, from people who understand the culture and the importance of religion in their lives. Each morning, Shahidi takes her young daughter to school. She is convinced that her daughter's generation will live in an Iran that's found a new balance between mosque and state.
I think that in the next 20 years, when my daughter reaches my age, she will live in a better society. And I hope that my daughter lives in a free, developed, and prosperous Iran. It will be an Iran for all Iranians.
Only reformist Islam has a very good chance to fight back with the radical Islam and with extremist Islam. I hope somehow a synthesis can emerge which somehow make compatible Islam with democracy. That's my hope. But I know we have a hard time to get there.
This is a challenge for the Iranian nation. But I still don't feel pessimistic. I feel that if the reform process proceeds correctly, there is a great chance.
There won't be the kind of drama of bringing down the Berlin Wall in one fell swoop. It's likely to take longer. It's likely to be more frustrating. But in the end, it is unquestionably going to be successful. Iran is going to change. It's going to open up one way or the other.
Sometimes change and instability are brought about not by human conflict, but rather by forces of nature, drought, famine, flooding, or by a scourge even more terrifying. Today, it is a disease that may pose the greatest threat to a nation's security: AIDS. Like many threats, little attention was paid to HIV/AIDS at first. Now we are beginning to recognize it for what it is: a worldwide plague with devastating implications, requiring leadership and commitment to turn the tide. In point of fact, the two may go hand in hand. Secretary of State Colin Powell has called AIDS a greater catastrophe than terrorism. Tonight, we have a story of how one country's leader, facing the decimation of his population, took on the disease that was ravaging his nation.
When you look at countries that have 20% of their adults infected with no access to treatment and who are going to die, there is no way that that can't have a profound destabilizing effect on a country.
It's a whole cataclysm. You've got police officers dying, healthcare workers dying, teachers dying. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
HIV/AIDS is the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa. The epidemic began in Uganda in the early 1980s. Back then, few understood the power of the disease to destabilize an entire continent, or the connection between failed states and terrorism.
People who look at Central and Southern Africa and say, it's far away, it's distant, it's remote. We said the same thing about terrorists. It happened in Africa. It's distant and remote.
When al-Qaeda operatives bombed the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, investigators found that terrorist cells were operating in several African countries. The August 1998 attacks killed 12 Americans and hundreds of Africans died.
A disease like AIDS, in addition to undermining men and women in the prime of their lives, undermine governments and allow criminal elements, terrorist elements, and other people to take these places over. We can't allow that to happen.
Terrorists thrive in vulnerable countries. In Africa now, AIDS has endangered whole nations. When AIDS began to take its toll, Ugandan families like Agnes Subi's were decimated.
This is where my mother lies. She actually died in 1990. I've lost my sister, my brothers, very many cousins, friends, schoolmates, people I work with, and very many important people in the community. Seeing many graves at the same time is, I just got this chill in my spine, because walking through in between the stones makes me remember lots of things. Very difficult. Horrible, I must say.
AIDS further degrades the already weak economies in Africa. The great majority of those infected are between the ages of 15 and 45, generally the most productive members of society.
You don't find businesses flocking to places that have an AIDS pandemic going on, where they know that if they invest and set up a factory, maybe a quarter of their labor force is going to be dying in the next few years of AIDS.
For years, Ugandans did not know why so many people were becoming sick and dying. Then in 1987, President Yoweri Museveni sent Ugandan soldiers to Cuba for military training.
And when they were there for training, they were tested for HIV. And the results revealed that a bigger number of them were HIV positive. And when that happened, the government of Cuba communicated with the government in Uganda.
And Castro said, Museveni, you have a problem. And President Museveni will say, Mr. President, what is that? He said, well, we're training your troops down here, you know, and we're testing all of our troops routinely, so we've been testing your troops for HIV as well. And you've got an incredible number of military personnel infected with HIV.
When AIDS ravages the military in countries like Uganda, it further destabilizes the country. The military can no longer maintain security.
The incidence is higher in many militaries than in the general populace. And that makes sense because these groups are the young, sexually active, mobile, deployed away from home, exposed to some more risky behaviors than the general population.
Recognizing the threat to Uganda's very future, President Museveni became the first African leader to openly address the devastating consequences of the AIDS pandemic.
So he made a decision to come public with it and start educating the population about it.
Okay. There is only one way to tell that you have HIV, and that's
radio programs pound home messages about abstinence, being faithful to partners, and using condoms.
We'll hear more about HIV after this track.
He became a crusader for that, you know. And so others also started talking about it. He encouraged, in fact, mandated more or less government officials, ministers, to do the same. It was either a choice of being, you know, burying our head in the sand or saving our own lives.
The president came out openly, and he has really encouraged, during his public speeches, he's encouraged people to abstain.
Those days we really feared, even to pronounce the word AIDS. It was very, very difficult. You would see like you've said something obscene or something, but if the president can say it, then it's very easy to tell everyone AIDS kills.
Former President Bill Clinton now heads a foundation to promote AIDS awareness. He says Museveni and his wife Janet deserve credit for going public.
And so between the two of them, they started this campaign called The Big Noise, and they made a lot of noise. And the big noise, among other things, they went out to all these country crossroads where the truckers were driving by, and they would stop and scream at people and tell them about AIDS. But they went from the highest AIDS rate in the world to less than half that in 5 years with no medicine and no outside money except a little bit of money we were giving them for this. And they did it through leadership and organized effort.
One of Uganda's most effective programs is the AIDS Support Organization, known as TASO, a non-governmental agency that began with 16 volunteers, all personally affected by the virus. Now TASO is a worldwide model, using music, dance, and drama to convince people of the urgent need for testing and prevention. TASO provides counseling and free anonymous testing with same-day results. Before this, many people never returned to find out if they were infected. Volunteers return to their villages to encourage the use of condoms.
AIDS is transmitted mainly through sexual intercourse with an infected person.
The campaign extends to Uganda's military. Sex education and HIV prevention classes are now mandatory.
How many of you can go without sex?
A Behind the jokes and embarrassment lies a national security issue for the United States. Accurate numbers are difficult to come by, but estimates of infection rates in African armies range up to 60% in some countries.
If you have a foreign military that is completely devastated by HIV/AIDS to the point where they cannot be a viable force for stability and protection of their people, then they cease to be able to ensure stability in that region. So our concern is other militaries becoming so devastated by HIV/AIDS that they're unable to play their role in society.
Uganda is the first nation in sub-Saharan Africa to reverse its rate of HIV infection from more than 30% in 1992 to less than 6% today.
But to proclaim victory in Uganda is premature because Uganda is like its impoverished neighbors. It's received a lot of foreign help which has been put to good use, but it hasn't received help on a scale that could really get the job done.
Despite Uganda's success, AIDS continues to be a major threat to the country's security and stability.
This is not just a moral imperative, okay? This is an economic imperative.
One of the most influential advocates in the shaping of public policy regarding AIDS and Africa is the Irish rock star Bono. In Uganda, with President Museveni, Bono urged that fighting AIDS in Africa could help in the broader war against terrorism.
Go to a neighborhood where people are dragging the United States name in the dirt and the flag of the United States in the dirt. Save the lives of their children, save the lives of their wives and their loved ones, and they will run extremist groups out of town. This is not just hearts and minds. This is lives.
Despite impressive scientific strides in treatment, there is little money for the medicines, not even $1 a day. For most Africans, AIDS remains a death sentence.
They are virtually no drugs. It is a very painful thing. The community, our community educators, go teach people. They refer them to the health unit to come and get treatment. But you go there and you find no drug.
These people say, feel like they can't afford the $1 a day to keep them, that keeps them alive. They can't afford it. I'm saying we can't afford to let them die, because it might cost more than $1 a day to retrain the teachers who are dying faster than we can train them, to look after the orphans.
That may be about to change. President Bush has committed the United States to provide $10 billion in new spending for AIDS in Africa.
I propose the emergency plan for AIDS relief, a work of mercy beyond all current international efforts to help the people of Africa.
But if the medical rescue of Africa were to begin tomorrow, the long-term problems will last for generations, threatening global security. In Uganda, more than 1 million children have lost one or both parents to AIDS. Many of those orphaned live on the streets. Many of them also have become infected.
We can't even begin to calculate the impact of having 40 million orphans in Africa at the end of the decade.
You're going to have 40 million people who are available to criminal gangs, to terrorist organizations, to be purchased. What are they going to do? Somebody offers them $50 to carry something? You have a potential army of recruits on the streets of those countries who are desperate and will respond to any offer of money.
There is growing recognition that the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa will pale in comparison to the next wave of the disease.
25 million people have died. There'll be 100 million people within 8 years. You get up to 100 million people, you're going to have some failed states. And it will cost us far more to clean up the mess from those failed states than it will to meet the budget, more or less along the lines the President talked about in the State of the Union, to fight AIDS. We spend that money, it'd be lots cheaper than going to 100 million AIDS cases and dealing with the consequences afterward.
A report by the National Intelligence Council for the Central Intelligence Agency estimates that by the year 2010, between 35 and 48 million people will be infected with HIV/AIDS in India, China, and Russia, three of the most populous and strategically important nations in the world. All three countries possess nuclear weapons. Their combined population is more than 2.5 billion people.
Health issues or HIV/AIDS issues creating instability and security, then heaven forbid that you have that type of a situation occur or a failed state develop, or in a nation that has weapons of mass destruction available or nuclear weapons available, then you create potentially devastating consequences there also. So it's all the more reason to address these issues.
In Russia, the number of people testing positive for HIV jumped 20 times in less than 4 years between the end of 1998 and mid-2002.
In our country, drugs is the main source of AIDS transmission. And indeed, the situation so far as AIDS and drugs is concerned in Russia has become quite acute.
1/3 of the conscripts going into Russian military forces have been rejected because of the linkages with drug use, including AIDS. That demonstrates the degree to which the disease already is having an impact on Russian military forces.
But the Russian government, like those in India and China, has been reluctant to acknowledge or deal with the AIDS crisis.
So far, I haven't heard a single high-ranking official who would call AIDS a priority. Unfortunately, in Russia, the public and the government fail to perceive the danger of HIV as a real danger or as a reality. This is seen on the financing aspects. For example, each year the federal program spends $5 or $6 million fighting AIDS. Considering the population of Russia is 145 million, you can see these allocations are too small.
It is important for us to take a non-traditional issue, something you don't normally associate with your intelligence community, because we believe it has real implications on what we call the hard issues. It plays right into the terrorist's hands. It all migrates to us in one way or another. The issues are interrelated. So our consciousness has to be raised beyond the traditional, because these non-traditional kinds of issues, some people call them soft issues, have a dramatic impact on the security of the country.
We've seen some of the challenges facing us as a nation and a world, and we've seen signs of reform, rebuilding, and hope. We should be under no illusions, however. There are no easy answers to the hard realities of the 21st century. A new picture, a mosaic as complex as human nature itself. Now I invite you to stay tuned as my colleague Frank Sesno discusses some of these issues. I'll be back in just a few minutes with some closing thoughts. Frank?
Walter, thanks. Throughout this series, we have graphically illustrated the challenges, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, failed states. But we've also tried to look at some of the solutions, leadership, accountability, and a genuine attention span. If we're to embrace the future and turn the tide, we'll be very busy in the coming years, and we'll need to have a truly global view of things. So we'll talk in a few minutes with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, Richard Haass. But first, we're joined by a distinguished panel. The French Ambassador to the United States, Jean-David Levitte. Ambassador Levitte served as the French representative to the United Nations before taking up his post in Washington. The Egyptian ambassador to Washington, Nabil Fahmy. Ambassador Fahmy, of course, is very familiar with sentiments in his region and has spoken forcefully about the need for a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. And Jim Hoagland. He's world affairs columnist with the Washington Post. Thank you very much for coming in. Ambassador Levitte, perhaps we can start with you. You have said the risk of today's world is not too much power from the United States, it's not enough power from failed states. Given the significant strains that we know exist in the world between France and the United States, the rebuilding that needs to happen in countries that we've looked at now to include Iraq, is there the international resolve, consensus, will, and wallet to do the job?
I think so, because now, since 9/11, everybody knows that we have to react and we have to have a global strategy. What does it mean? We have to act global, that is to have everybody on board, all the states, and we have also to use all the tools in our hands, military and covert action when need be, but also financial action, economic reconstruction when it is necessary, and of course law enforcement and a better cooperation between the states.
It's not enough simply to lead the world by forcing an agenda or by persuading others of your agenda. That's important to set the principles, set norms. But you also have to lead the world by listening to the agendas of others and finding a way to dialogue with them. In the Middle East, needless to say, the priority of most regions, most countries of the region, has for years been trying to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. That, I believe, will become prominent again as we move further down the reconstruction process in Iraq. We have to go back and solve that issue.
I think it's important not to lose sight of Afghanistan and Iraq in this discussion, and to stay focused on the questions of nation building that you began this discussion with, Frank. When you look at Afghanistan today, you have to say that American intervention there produced a better result than what went before. Certainly from an American standpoint, the elimination of a base for terrorist training camps is a plus. And if you look at the lives of the Afghan people today, while far from perfect, it is a lot better than it was on September 10th, 2001.
I completely agree with Mr. Hoagland that the situation in Afghanistan today is better than what it was before September 11th, and is justified. What happened was justified. But I mention again, in Egypt, we raised the issue of terrorism 15 years ago as a global problem, calling for what my colleague from France was talking about, a global attempt to deal with this problem. So there's no contradiction between having a preemptive dialogue about problems that will affect the globe and being forceful and resolute in addressing them once they emerge.
But something has fundamentally changed post-Iraq because we've gone through a preemptive war. What lessons have been learned in Europe and France as a result of this? How does it change the way the rest of the 21st century is going to unfold?
All countries of the world must have the same perception of what we have to do, and then we have to join forces and act.
But if I may, you're never going to get all countries in the world to have the same perception about anything.
Well, I'm not so pessimistic, and I think that 9/11, for instance, was a moment where the whole world was united, supportive of the United States, in agreement with what we had to do, and the Security Council unanimously supported the military action in Afghanistan. So you see, unity of the world is a possibility.
But I think September 11th really changed perceptions about the question of failed states and national security much more in this country than it did in the rest of the world, and has led to a different approach. We are now involved, the United States is now involved, again in areas in the third world we thought after the end of the Cold War we would never again have to be involved in a security manner. That is in large part because of the danger that we now understand they perceive. I think one of the valuable contributions that this series has made, Frank, is in this session today of linking the question of AIDS and of weapons of mass destruction in failed states and how this can become an extremely dangerous situation. It's an example of the new kind of thinking that's needed in world affairs. The United States has to play a major leadership role in bringing that kind of thinking and, quite frankly, Jean-David, in abandoning a lot of the very nice platitudes of the past for active steps to resolve real dangers.
Ambassador Levitt, how is the world to deal with the other nations that have weapons of mass destruction, that have been put on notice effectively by Washington that they may be the subject of a preemptive war if necessary?
Well, you know that we don't agree with the idea of preemptive war. We think it's a dangerous idea. Let's think about India and Pakistan for 1 minute. If India says, I feel threatened, I must engage India in a preemptive war, then it could be a disaster between two nuclear states. So we think that collective action is better, and I respectfully disagree with Jim when he says that yes, it's time for action and action should take place. We agree that it is time for action. In Iraq, action was peaceful disarmament. That's the heart of our problem. But beyond, we are in favor of action, and I agree with my colleague of Egypt. I think we should go beyond Iraq and now try to solve the problem of the Middle East peace process. It is possible. And if there is a new government for the Palestinian people, then we should move on.
Final question. If the United States and others can actually succeed in encouraging democracy and real reform in Iraq, what are the implications for the region and the world? A, can it happen? B, will there be, Ambassador Fahmy, start us with this, political reform to include Egypt across the region?
Well, I think encouraging democracy anywhere in the world is useful and helpful and a constructive step. The point is, how do you encourage democracy? Democracy is an evolutionary process. If it happens in Iraq, it will happen over a period of years after a number of obstacles and problems. But we support the evolution of democracy in Iraq. We support the evolution of democracy in all the Middle East. Even more democracy in my own country. I think there's more than people see, but even more is required and encouraged. That being said, I encourage more democracy in how countries work with each other, in dealing with each other's concerns. Democracy is not a domestic process alone. It is a process which we all have to live through, even internationally.
Frank, I think it certainly can happen in the region. It can happen in Iraq perhaps a little bit faster than the Egyptian ambassador seems to think it will. But it's going to be a process that has to be undertaken country by country, population by population. Societies survive from the bottom up, from citizens becoming actively involved through democracy or some form of representative government. The Arab world has resisted, for reasons that are very complex, the democratization trends that have flowed around the world since the end of the Cold War.
There is a choice between chaos and progress. And I'm quite confident that if we can build this global coalition, we'll have progress. Progress in terms of more democracy, more market economy and development, and also solutions for AIDS, SARS, and so on, because they exist. It's a question of will, it's a question of funds. And if there is a political will, then we'll have enough money to solve the problems.
Gentlemen, thanks to you all. Appreciate it. Joining us now, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She served in the Clinton administration, and during that time was also the U.S. representative to the United Nations. Also, Ambassador Richard Haass. He's currently Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. I want to thank you both for making time to come in for this conversation. How do you both respond to the criticism that is often voiced in the United States, especially in the midst of and following the operation, the war in Iraq, that you're talking about partnerships, but you're going it alone? You're making it a unipolar world driven by unilateral decision-making.
That criticism simply doesn't stand up to serious scrutiny. American leadership, which is a necessary component of successfully meeting these challenges, is not to be confused with unilateralism. We did not win the war in Iraq by our own. Remember, we did it against the backdrop of 12.5 UN Security Council resolutions. On the ground, we didn't do it simply with British and, say, Australian forces, but we did it with the access to bases and overflight rights that came from any number of governments. Before that, for years, we had sanctions in place. Again, any number of governments supported those sanctions. Now, in the aftermath of the conflict, to rebuild Iraq economically, politically, and the rest, we're going to do it with dozens of countries, dozens of international agencies, non-governmental organizations.
More coalitions of the willing?
Very much so. I think what we're seeing is that for many of these challenges, we don't have in place formal alliances. What alliances require is a great deal of predictability. Who the foe is, who the adversary is, where the adversary is likely to strike, with what weapons. Hence, during the Cold War, we could have a series of alliances because it was a fairly predictable world. In this world, We don't have that luxury, and as a result, we're going to have to cobble together coalitions of the willing to deal with most of the challenges we're going to face.
Well, I hate to look at it that way, because I think it puts us into a position of doing very much what we all call ad hocery, is that you have to try to pull these coalitions together, and they're very difficult, and it's hard to figure out exactly who's in it. And while I definitely no longer think that what the U.S. action was unilateral, I think there was a real question about who actually is in this coalition of the willing, and whether small islands in the Pacific are really part of the action. But I also do think that alliances do provide a certain structure that I think helps in terms of dealing with some of these global problems. So for me, it's a combination of developing the alliances, being very involved in a series of treaties that I think help to stabilize the international system, but also be willing to supplement them with various kinds of coalitions at a particular time.
Is the future in treaties in the United Nations as far as you and this administration are concerned?
I think the answer is, unfortunately, it depends. Take one area where the UN and arrangements have played a big role is the war against terrorism. After September 11th, you had the passage of Security Council Resolution 1373, and you've seen extraordinary international cooperation, say, to shut down the funding of these terrorist groups, all sorts of law enforcement and intelligence cooperation. So there's an area where the Security Council's played a central role, and there's quite a lot of international cooperation. Another area would be trade. Under the World Trade Organization, again, a lot of cooperation. In the areas of weapons of mass destruction so far, while we've got a lot of arrangements in place, we haven't quite gotten to the point where there's the kind of international building blocks that you'd like to see.
All right, Ambassador, let me press you, if I may, for a moment, and you're welcome to join me in this, disagree or agree, however you feel. There are plenty of people in the United States and around the world who will listen to this and say, it sounds to me, based on what you're saying and what has happened, that you're prepared to embrace the United Nations when it's convenient, and when it's not, you'll go it on your own. And the United States is not winning a lot of friends around the world, if you listen to read the newspapers and look at public opinion polling, because there is this perception that it's going alone.
I plead guilty to that. Let me just say that. I think it would be a mistake for the United States to say, no matter what, we are going to go with the United Nations, so when there's consensus, we're going to act, and when there's not consensus, we're not. I think we have to accept the fact that at this moment in history, you simply don't have 100% consensus amongst the major powers, the United States, China, Japan, Russia, Europe, what have you. And so where you do have consensus, yes, of course, try to work it out within the UN. But when you don't have consensus, yes, I would argue the United States has to be willing to find other forms of multilateralism, possibly NATO or possibly ad hoc coalitions, if that's the best we can do.
I think the real question, and we're looking at what life will be like throughout the 21st century. And the question is whether we pay enough attention to these institutions to deal with what are some of their defects. There's no question that the UN doesn't do always what we want to do, or that the NATO alliance needs to be always made relevant. But the question is your attitude towards them. And what's kind of bothered me is not so much that we've gone totally unilateral, because I think we just talked about that, but whether there really is a sense that these institutions serve us, all of us in the civilized world, in the long run, and therefore whether we shouldn't be putting more effort into fixing them. I spent a lot of time when I was at the UN trying to get reform, trying to get the budgets worked out, trying to get them not to be so bureaucratic, but we saw them as an important instrument. And I think what's happening now is that the UN is kind of seen as a pain in the neck, and that we don't really want to use it, and therefore it will deteriorate because we're not going to give it the kind of attention that it needs.
One of the unusual things marking this era, and we've looked at it repeatedly this week, is the notion of weapons of mass destruction, the reality that they exist and that they are proliferating and that they can fall in the wrong hands. What, if we were to look at solutions to this problem, what would be the top of your list?
I'd probably push back a little bit and resist the word solutions. If you think of these things like disease, you can't solve it necessarily, but you can dramatically reduce your vulnerability to it. In some cases, you can beat it back. In some cases, you can fight against it. Solutions, though, suggest to me a degree of perfection that we may not be able to reach. In the case of weapons of mass destruction, you've got a whole set of tools. Obviously, you want to cut down on the sources of the technology and the capabilities. That's why we have all these supplier arrangements around the world, all sorts of export controls. That's part of it. You want to address the causes of conflict. So say between India and Pakistan, which already now have weapons of mass destruction. You want to make sure they're never used by accident. You want to make sure that, where possible now, we get these two countries to develop a relationship. Because right now, they barely talk, they don't trade, there's no tourism. So there we have, if you will, a large diplomatic answer. In the case of Iraq, we tried diplomacy. It didn't work. So the United States had to lead an international coalition to solve the problem using military force.
Well, I think also that you do have to look at the whole treaty structure. Because while when you have arms control agreements, they're not perfect, at least what you do is create a mechanism whereby you can take people through a process when they're cheating. And I think that it's it's counterproductive to kind of decide that treaties are too limiting. So I think in addition to the various points that Ambassador House mentioned, I do think it's important to see whether there are not ways to bring some international control to the whole process, because it's very hard to deal with the issue of weapons of mass destruction alone. We have to have partners in that who not only will not provide the sources for these weapons to be made, but also to provide the punishment when they are used, and in that we need other people.
You mentioned the India-Pakistan. The other night on this panel discussion, Hussein Haqqani, a Pakistani, was talking about the fact that in his region he is fearful that we are going to come yet again very close to the point of a nuclear exchange, or certainly much deeper hostilities. And he said in that area, the notion of preemption, which was one of the notions that underlay the Iraq situation, plays a very different role, and a dangerous one. Would you talk about that?
Well, he's right to be concerned, and this year is not over yet, and it's still possible that India and Pakistan have the potential to be one of the largest, if not the largest, stories of the year. So Mr. Haqqani and others are right to be very concerned. Yes, we used preemption in the case of Iraq, essentially after years of diplomacy didn't work. But just because one strategy works in one case, it doesn't mean it works in another. We ourselves are not applying it to other situations uniformly. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all foreign policy. In the case of India, India has to ask itself not simply whether it has certain rights to use force. It also has to ask itself whether it's smart. It has to ask itself whether, on balance, would we as a country, in this case India, be better off? And I would suggest not. Not only has India not exhausted all the diplomatic potential, all the diplomatic possibilities with Pakistan. Indeed, they've hardly exhausted them at all, unfortunately. But it's not clear at all that any Indian use of military force would leave India better off.
It isn't so much what we think. It is, however, how the other countries see our example. And I think you've analyzed the India-Pakistan thing correctly, but what troubles me is that they may not go through that whole process, that they may in fact say, all right, the U.S. decides to preempt, so why shouldn't we, because this is now an acceptable doctrine. And I would argue that preemption per se is something that is in the line of self-defense, the way that we practiced it, but turn into a doctrine. It creates the possibility that other countries will think, okay, well, that's a good example. So we haven't had enough of a discussion about what preemption is all about, and I think it kind of got away from us in terms of all of a sudden saying, well, this is a new way that is acceptable for countries to act, because not all countries are like us.
Is the Middle East somehow different? Will it be harder to plant democracy in the Middle East than it was in Eastern Europe or Latin America?
Ultimately, I would suggest not. But so far, the Middle East has largely missed out on the great trends of democratization and economic reform. And I think partially we bear some responsibility, we as a nation, because we've never made it a tremendous priority. And what you're seeing now is an interesting realization across the political spectrum that this has got to change. Essentially, what we've done is we've realized that we've got to put this set of issues on the American foreign policy agenda. And if we're successful here, I actually think it will have benefits on everything else this series has been about. If you have young men in particular who have jobs, who are politically engaged in their societies, who are not alienated, who are well educated, these young men are much less likely to become terrorists, and that's why all of this fits together.
I think one of the issues here, and this comes out again in your series, is the generational question. In many ways, we do need new generations of leaders in the Middle East, and if we can manage to not have them all dislike us for whatever actions we've taken, then it's a big step forward. And therefore, the educational process, the idea that they can be a democracy. I just refuse to banish certain parts of the world and decide that they can't be democracies, because we've seen otherwise.
Let me conclude with you both on this note. People will watch and they say, well, here are these two very smart, very articulate people who have been at the top of government helping to shape policy. But what can I do with all these massive and sometimes overwhelming problems as a citizen, as an individual? You have advice?
Well,
you have thoughts?
I think we all need to learn more about the Middle East and to specifically understand Islam. I think if more Americans actually began to take some interest in what the Muslim religion is about and to understand what the roots are of the discontent. And we need an educational process also. It's very fine for us to say they all need to get educated. I think we need to get more educated. Also, I think we need to be able to support our government when it wants to put money into foreign assistance and into the building that will be required for the long-term support of changes. And it's the short attention span that I think the American public can help overcome by being supportive of change.
Secretary Albright essentially just moved to exactly where I wanted to go. The American people can help with resources, supporting them. Foreign aid tends to be something of an orphan in the American political debate. It would be nice to get more resources there. Free trade agreements, again, really important. One other thing they can do is they can go there. Travel in the sense of getting more familiar with that part of the world, letting people see what Americans are like. So it is a part of the world that as we start this new century, we have got to get right, or everything you've talked about will probably emanate from the Middle East and will cause us tremendous harm.
I also think that one of the things we need to look at is we have always thought that there was a trade-off between stability and democracy. And I think what we need to understand is ultimately the greatest stability in the Middle East will be when these countries have moved through the process and have become democracies. And it's going to take a long time, and we need to be able to be supportive in terms of moving in that direction.
Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, thank you. Ambassador Richard Haass, appreciate your views. Big picture. The issues and challenges we've discussed here are daunting, but as we've seen, there are ideas, initiatives, and options available. They can lead to progress, even breakthrough. Perhaps the most basic task and the real purpose of this series, Avoiding Armageddon, is to be sure we are informed and aware, to provoke discussion and debate, to engage the issues and ourselves and the decision makers who will shape the future. I'm Frank Sesno. Walter?
Thank you, Frank. These are indeed troubling and frightening times, as we have